like to introduce our panel today. We have the following people speaking today on GLP-1 Peptide, Gold Rush, what's driving 80% of CDMO growth. We have Trishul, Shah, Director Global Sales and Marketing, PolyPeptide Group. We have Mimoun, Ayoub, who is Senior VP, Global Head, Sales and Key Accounts with Corden Pharma. Steve Beagle, a longtime friend of mine, co-founder, Pharmeagle Partners Consulting. And Tim Miley, right next to me here, Director of BD with Jiuzhou Pharma. All right, so we'd like to kick off some discussion points. First point being, what is driving the market explosion demand for GLP-1s? So I'd like to first call on Mimoun, Ayoub. What are your thoughts on this as far as what's driving the market explosion for GLP-1s, the explosion in demand?
Yeah, so thank you. Good morning, everybody. I think the, unlocking the mechanism for the metabolic disorders, especially with the GLP-1s, although, the first GLP-1, the exenatide, was approved almost 25 years ago, but still it was a twice daily injection, the Byetta. Some of you are very familiar with that. Now going into a pen device and injection once weekly, I think that especially with the efficacy that we know in terms of weight loss, because the obesity is actually driving that growth. It's approximately 70% of the revenue, and the other 30% is type 2 diabetes. I think that's it's a combination between the efficacy, drug delivery, I think pretty much successful, and also the mode of action we have, I think, with the side chain that is now linked to all of, or most of the GLP-1s that binds albumin. It helps in the bioavailability, and this is how these drugs have become really very successful nowadays.
Thank you. And Trishul?
Yeah, I think I would agree with everything that Mimoun said. Just add to that as more and more GLP-1s are being put. Can you hear me now? There we go. Okay. Yeah, as more GLP-1s are being, GLP-1 analogs are being developed, or even now if you look at some of the other metabolic peptides out there, such as amylins, GIPs, glucagons, we're seeing that beyond the metabolic diseases, obesity and diabetes, we're seeing indications in other health areas, such as cardiovascular. You even heard about Alzheimer's a few years ago through Richard DiMarchi. So I think when you start seeing these new indications coming in, that's also driving some of the growth in these metabolic peptides, I like to call them as. We also see indications for NASH, for example. So I think that's a big driver as well. They seem to be very versatile molecules.
Okay. Steve?
What I've seen, and I'm a small consultant, so they're coming from, everybody's calling on these guys. I'm kind of looking for work, so my livelihood remains with people out here. But what I've seen with two clients recently, and I worked in peptides with MSN in 92 to 99, and so I have a lot of experience in them. But what I've noticed now is you got 50% of CDMO expansion is definitely semaglutide type compounds. And then even, tirzepatide, retatrutide, all these compounds are 50% of the entire CDMO pie. Then you have another roughly 30% in biologics, monoclonals, and then the last sterile fill finish, which is maximized. So I did hear some things this morning from Stefan that I somewhat disagree with, but the financial page is always first and foremost in this business. So I think there's capacity. I think there's a lot of excitement around glutides, and I think it's there. But at the same time, you know, I was around in the injectable rush when I took, you know, Ranbaxy and Cipla into injectables, and it's kind of the wave is very high right now, and it's going to come crashing, and we'll get into that. Thanks.
All right. And Tim?
Thanks a lot. I'm actually going to lead in with a question to the crowd. Do we have any representation in the room right now from Eli Lilly? Any Lilly folks in the crowd? I'll come back to the reason for that question later. Okay, no one. Good. I have an ulterior motive in that question I'll come back to probably later. But on a personal level, I'll say for me it's rather academic. Being a fellow obese American, I have a sweet tooth. For me, it's rather easy to see what's driving the explosion. If you look at marketing through the media, it's weight loss. I mean, it's nice to obviously address medical issues like type 2 diabetes, initially through, of course, insulin being one early product, but some 20 some odd years ago when I was, let's say, in the generic sector, I worked for Sando, and we were attempting to fundamentally look at potential for a paragraph 4 attack against, let's call it, product Loretta. We were trying to discern, based on clinical data at that time, for diabetes, how that might extend into some other things involving glucagon and weight loss. So fast forward now, a quarter century later, it's obvious that here in America, what's going to drive these products is going to be those driven toward weight loss. I mean, I am guilty as anyone else of eating too much chocolate, too much sugar. I love my sweets. I'm obese, not proud of it, but if you're looking for a market to hit, clearly in America, it's obesity. So for me, it's a straight fundamental answer.
And I would have to second that. You know, I spoke here last year, and I had lost, I think it was close to 90, 95 pounds. Since then, I'm down about 110 pounds. I think that's approaching 48, 49 kilos. So for me, it was a health issue, and I think that most Americans and Chinese and Indians that are having weight problems, this is extremely important. This is extremely important for them. So that's one of the key things that is driving. That's one of the key things that is driving the weight loss sales. So I think we've hit on the first question: manufacturing and supply chain today and tomorrow. Peptide synthesis, the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why, raw material sourcing, and bottlenecks. So I'd like to start again with Mimoun. And what are your thoughts there, Mimoun, regarding supply chain? This was a big part of our conversation last year.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest challenge today in the supply of development and supply of GLP-1 drugs. I think most of the CMOs, including Pharma as well, announced investment in capacity before the Trump administration announced the tariff issue. So some of them have really pretty big sunk money actually in investment, and there's a lot of uncertainty now how the geopolitical aspects will impact the supply chain in the in the GLP-1 space. This is on the API side, but there is another component which is as you mentioned, which is the sourcing of raw materials. So that's a pretty big challenge. However, I think you need to look at this case by case. I mean, if I take the example of US location sourcing raw material from China or from India with a 30% tariffs, assuming, put this in numbers, just really that we are all on the same page. So assuming a 30% raw material cost in the API and a 30% tariffs on the raw materials, we are talking about a 9%, approximately 10% impact on the cost of goods for the API. Now, keep in mind that the manufacturing in the US is much more expensive than Europe, for example. So I think this offsets somehow the tariffs. And I believe when it comes to really the API manufacturing, I don't think there is a big difference. All in all, you know, whether you manufacture that API in Europe or in the US. So I think that's one aspect. I think what will also impact the supply chain and the volumes in the future is really how good those combination therapies will be, because I expect also the volumes, maybe the patient population will increase, but the GLP-1 volumes will decrease, in my opinion, because combination therapies will lead to much less API injected or administered to patients because they are more efficient. And I think also if the drug delivery continues to, or with all different mechanisms, some of monoclonal antibodies delivering GLP-1s, we see this today, for example, the Amgen, Maritide. I think this drug delivery system, if it improves, we will see also injections once monthly, maybe once quarterly. So, which means that the volume of the GLP-1 potentially will decrease in the future.
Okay. Trishul?
So my thoughts here are, I mean, with this wave and this boom of peptides through the GLP-1 space, the metabolic peptide space, there is also a constraint on the API side from a manufacturing available capacity perspective. And that's having an impact not just for the metabolic peptides, but peptides which are used for other indications, oncology, for example, radiopharmaceuticals. So finding CDMOs that have the available capacity in time or readily available has also changed. So that's a constraint that we're seeing. The raw material vendors, of course, are required to produce a lot of these amino acids or building blocks well ahead of time. And from what has been set up in the past, that's also a constraint there. So that's something that's had to ramp up. Now, you can take this a little bit further and look at why is this happening. So, and it goes back to the standard chemistry that's used for manufacturing peptides. And if you go back, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, it was Bach chemistry. And at that time, we were producing multi-kilograms. And then came Fusion, where Roche at the time said, we're going to be about 100 kilos. So they really changed the game there by introducing FMOC chemistry to make a much more scalable process. Now, we're again at that precipice again of finding new technologies to make a process much more intensive, higher yielding. And we're seeing that, and Tim was asking about, is any Lilly people here? But I think some of the drivers, just like Roche were the drivers back in 2005, we're seeing Lilly's really pushing the envelope here with new chemistry as well on their side and producing the drug substance and the drug product side of it.
Thank you.
Could I add maybe one comment on the tariffs and the raw material sourcing? I think the trend we might see in the future is that the drugs will be manufactured where they will be used. So in other words, maybe a US location will manufacture for the US market, and then maybe Europe for Europe and rest of the world, or potentially Asia for Europe and the rest of the world, to avoid or to overcome all of these tariffs and geopolitical challenges.
In terms of the labor costs in the U.S., I mean, that's what I'm not buying. We're just not competitive enough with what we've been able to accomplish with China, with India. And perhaps, I often say pharma has not learned the lessons from the automobile industry. So, to me, when I think about everything coming in through the US for the US market, then it's going to be hurting the US economy because you're not going to be able to pay the premium of here in the States.
Yeah.
Just,
I mean, it's an absolutely valid comment. I mean, as I said before, if you take a 30% tariffs on raw materials in an API where the raw materials are 30% of the cost of the API, it's an impact of 9%. But producing in the US is potentially 20-25% more expensive than Europe. So, I mean, if you take, you know, the overall picture, probably not worth producing in the US, and you still pay the 15% tariffs on a European good. And you are pretty...
with the most favored
Right.
nation now being Europe, that's the interesting
Yeah.
next rung of the complexity of what we're looking at.
Yeah. I mean, the other challenge is that, you know, the pharma and biotech companies will not make these type of decisions because they don't know if this whole situation will revert or, you know, back to where it was before, you know, the second mandate of President Trump. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and decisions are kind of, maybe the trend is, yeah, look for a U.S. location, you know.
I'd just like to add too here is, I look at it from a statistical perspective. There's 13 DMFs coming out of China, 13 manufacturers now who have DMFs in China. There's 2 in India. So we start to look at capacity and where it's being built. I was working for Dr. MSN, and I hate to go back how long, but he said to me, we're going to build a peptide facility on the top floor of my R&D facility. Next year, we'll have it together, and we'll be doing liraglutide. And he did it, because if you have resources in other parts of the world, you have economies of scale. This idea that I'm sorry if there's Lilly people here or even Novo people. Everybody knows what's happening to Novo now. The world is all changing, and you're right, and you're seeing it from your perspective. The tariffs will play a part, but the capacity is going to play a bigger part. And you look at companies like JY Med. I mean, these guys are massive, massive players. Now, if Trump decides to keep China out of it, yeah, it's a totally different ballgame for everybody in this room. But I don't believe he will, because it's the same story now that it was 4 years ago when he first came to office. And this gentleman in the front row, Robert Geiger, invited me to a call with Michael Pence's Human Health Secretary's lobbyist group out of Indianapolis. And they wanted to understand supply chain in China and India, because there was 40 shortlisted drugs at the time. And they wanted to get China at that time out of it. And by the way, you know, I came out of school, I hate to admit how old I am, but Hatch-Waxman, I was in a lab, 1984, Hatch-Waxman came, and I reversed generics my whole career. So at the end of the day, you know, come on, guys. Onshoring, yes, it's coming, and I'm investing in it, and so is everybody else, and I wanted to see it here. But we created the monster, and let's be realistic about how we're not going to. This is not a political discussion at all. It's all scientific, but I wanted to add that point. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
Boy, here's a topic I could talk for the next 6 or 7 or 8 hours on this. And unfortunately, I've been employed by both the generic sector and the brand side, so I could speak out both sides of my mouth during that 8 hours as well. I think the only point I would really make on this whole entire topic is that whether it's you're buying API for a first-to-file generic, where you're first and will be first and only generic for X number of months or years, or if you're a CDMO supporting an innovator, really ultimately what you want is a guarantee. And then, you know, of course you want that in writing, but you want guarantee that you're going to get what you want when you want it. So for me, the supply chain boils down to, and going back to my Novartis days, I was buying generic API with Novartis cash. I could name my price.
And giving me
These two guys. Didn't publicize that at the time, and I would never do that. But more than half of my APIs I was buying for the generic side were coming out of Europe, which at this present day and age would never happen. 40% were coming out of India, 10% out of China. Those statistics, I'm sure if I were still at Sandoz, would now look totally different than what they did in 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. but I wanted guarantees, because if I was going to be first, I wanted to make sure that we weren't abating or missing market share due to lack of raw materials, API, whatever the case may be. And in the case of some of these products, the device. The biggest hurdle for us attacking Loretta back in the day was not the API. I could get the API from a Gila Monster or wherever at the drop of a hat from a couple of different sources, but that device was the problem. That's what threw us and our legal team and our QA and our regulatory people, our curveball from a generic perspective, was that plastic device. It was not, I'll be kind, and this is the reason I asked about Lilly folks, it was not optimal at the time, 20 some odd years ago, and the instructions were requiring a chemical engineering and biomedical degree to understand how to prime the thing. It was a nightmare. So making a generic to that and being just as, I hate to say this, just as bad as the innovator to be substitutable was profound. So you have enough hurdles, technically speaking, in bringing markets or bringing products to market, whether it be innovator or generic. You need to eliminate as many question marks as possible. I want guarantees in my supply chain, and I don't want failure. And at Novartis, they didn't accept failure. So really, the prices didn't matter per se. But you really want to make sure you get what you request when you need it. So that's the bottom line, really, fundamentally, whether it be generic or innovator.
Very good. So regarding the next topic I want to cover with the panel, my thoughts are regarding manufacturing supply. I'll just short blurb. I've been participating in it's like a government project on key starting materials. And this is involving certain cabinet members that President Trump's working with. And some of those key starting materials are extremely, we'll say, top security drugs that we would need in time of war or so forth. And so they were part of the situation there was they were consulting me about, logistics and trying to set up manufacturing closer to home. We say offshore, but maybe in Mexico or Canada or whatnot, where, especially Mexico, where the labor rates might be much cheaper. However, it's in our backyard and we have a lot more control over that. So this is a project with Dr. Oz, and I've been working on this behind the scenes. And so I see things changing with regards to China and India as far as the supply situation, that we will not be as dependent on that in future years. And they're planning ahead for that very situation. Next subject, Mimoun, CDMO strategy to compete, differentiation, and proprietary technology, demand for GLP-1 and versus other in-house priorities. Any comments there?
Yeah, sure. But I would like first to comment on what you just said. I mean, again, the supply chain to cover the raw material sourcing, I think this will remain a key topic, as I said before. I mean, there are two ways of, the pharma will not let go the margin, so that's very clear, right? So and there are two ways to increase the margin. Either you reduce the cost or you increase the price. These are the two options. Reducing the cost, that means you have to work on the raw materials because it's a substantial piece of the cost of goods. And the only way to do that, I'm sorry, is again to keep the supply chain as it is already well established today from China, India, Europe, etc. So I think it's an illusion to think that working with raw materials coming off the US, that you could put a drug on the market that is cost competitive, that can compete with some other, we're talking about small molecules. Maybe this is another topic we should also address in this panel, because they will be competing with GLP-1s. Now, with regard to differentiations and their second question, yes, of course. I mean, GLP-1 molecules are very complex molecules, long peptide sequences requiring very specific manufacturing assets, using huge amount of raw materials and solvents, especially for the downstream processing, purification, isolation of the final API. So one of the differentiation is really to work on the sustainability, so making a sustainable drug, so improving the PMI. And I know, most of you, at least, I mean, for us, Corden Pharma has committed the SBTi, to reduce our carbon footprint by 50% by 2035. So it's a substantial decrease despite the growth. So your sales, your revenue will be growing, but your carbon footprint will be decreasing. You can only do that through new technologies. And new technologies, for example, in the peptide space is, the tag-assisted peptide synthesis. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. This is something that can help you reduce the raw material cost by 40, 50%, solvent reduction by 90+%. Yield is better, purity is better, which means you produce more API with less raw materials. And it reduces also the cost. So this is something we are putting forward. That's something we are also using today for clinical supply and in some validation programs. So we will see the next drugs on the market coming, at least from Corden Pharma, using this technology.
So, Trishul, do you have any comments regarding CDMO strategy, the points that I made earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what Mimoun said is accurate. That, so going back to your initial question about the key raw materials, that is critical, having a source for that. It is true that the only way you increase your margins is either increase the price or lower the costs. But you can also lower the costs first by sourcing cheaper raw materials, but also developing processes that have higher yields. So you use less raw materials to produce more product. And that ties in with technology and introducing new technology, using sustainable technology. Now that's becoming a big deal in Europe with the REACH accords that are out there. So, removing DMF, for example, is a long-term goal that we have on our side, or reducing the amount that's being used. Utilizing cocktails or reagents that are safer for the environment, if you will. And that's a drive, I think, across most CDMOs that you find in this space. Again, the processes that were developed for peptide manufacturing go back 20, 25 years in labs, in academic labs, and they've just basically increased. But rather than just scaling up, you hit a tipping point, and we're at the tipping point. Now we have to look at developing a process that's a lot more sustainable, a lot more efficient. Flow chemistry is becoming a big deal. I think there's a talk on that on Friday, so that would be interesting. A lot of the things that the small molecule world has done before can now be applied or should be applied towards peptide manufacturing.
Okay. And Steve, do you have any comments regarding CDMO strategy to compete? And
Yeah, just from a business development perspective, what I've seen in my work is that everybody sees that wave ending. The largest CDMOs in the injectable space have been surged by vaccines, rare disease, all these areas on top of, weight loss. So, there's plenty of injectable capability, but who really wants to inject themselves? So the surge is going to also come now. It's coming to oral dose. It's coming to innovative ways. Innovative waves in API, absolutely. We've been talking microprocessing, flow, all these things. But it's a business game, and these guys have to work on sustainability on the API side. I've worked for API producers. But in the end, it's really how can that quality remain and chase what is going to be the future, and I believe the future is not going to be injectables in this space, and I believe it's going to be near competitors. These could be maybe not even, believe it or not, peptides. So there's weight loss in a lot of ways. This is a miracle drug for a lot of people, and I'm so happy for so many people, but at the same time, it reminds me of a period long ago when, I worked in FenFen, I've worked in other projects where, you have this wave, people have done well, and I'm really excited about it, but I think there's a challenge ahead of us, and nobody's really talking about that. That's the innovation. Is it going to come from us in this room? I hope so, because I think we should.
I'd like to jump to regulatory and quality considerations. Tim, do you have some insight there? Regulatory and quality considerations.
I mean, this is going to be a bit of a mix of an answer and a pitch for Jiuzhou as well. What I've seen in the 10 months I've been with these guys at Jiuzhou is, first and foremost, speed in terms of turnaround time in quoting for different innovator projects, and primarily small molecule, of course, because I'm responsible for the small molecule sales in North America. But secondarily on that, I can't think of another entity from whom I've purchased in my past life or for whom I've sold to the market from a manufacturer that has the speed and rapidity of being able to, if not finding a raw material source, but creating it if need be. So for me, in terms of competitive nature that offers high quality, we being Ecovatus gold medal, of course, level, and being audited by all sorts of regulatory authorities throughout the world, many times over, you walk into a situation with certain CDMOs that you automatically feel comfortable because of the pedigree. That is something going back now temporarily to my buying days at Sandoz Novartis. That was always the very first filter is, in terms of quality, what can you show me that gives me immediate comfort that rules out any sort of anxiety whatsoever. So again, many places in China will offer that at a cost that's very extremely competitive, to say the least. But as far as GLP-1s per se, I think technologically speaking, the science in China is there without question. The capacity, of course, is without question. Speed, without question. The raw materials and the supply chain, I don't think is going to, frankly speaking, again, this is my buy hat now temporarily, I don't know of any other region in the world that will compete effectively with China end-to-end in peptides over the long term. I just honestly do not see that in a financial or speed sense. So quality will always be, that's always going to be a factor that's going to be a decision-making, and it's just the fact of the matter of being in a regulated market. But whether or not that's necessarily going to be a differentiator, I don't know that. For me, it's more so about speed of delivery than anything else, based on what I've seen so far in these past 10 months with Jiuzhou in the small molecule space, and I think secondarily the peptides space as well.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to jump to small molecule versus...
Rob,
Yeah.
there's some questions here.
Question?
Yeah.
Tim, on the regulatory front, how do you think the challenges for the FDA throws at the GLP-1 manufacturers is going to be sustained?
I didn't hear the first part of that question. On the what front?
On the regulatory front,
Uh-huh.
especially the guidance. The guidance on GLP-1 is very scant. Comparative studies or sameness studies, FDA comes up with everything as they go along.
Welcome to FDA.
That is one aspect. And second, on the GLP-1s, how do you think products like naltrexone is going to take away a large part of the GLP-1 market share on the weight loss? Because substantially they've been found to be much more safer and much more non-addictive and has less side effects. Because I've learned from both sides. I've sold narcotics, I've sold GLP. And having looked at some, we realized that FDA came up with new challenges every time Sun went with their applications. And as a small company, Sun Pharma, we were very clear what we had to give them.
I'm going to answer that with a philosophical, technical reply. I guess you could say this. I think it's going to be driven by the specificity and the targeting available that you can afford yourself using a peptide to target weight loss versus what can be achieved with a small molecule. Because safety notwithstanding, I mean, obviously, if you're the more complex a molecule in graduating from small molecule to peptides to monoclonals, the more complex it becomes, the more factors are involved. So I think it's going to come down to longer term, how, comparatively speaking to your point, can you remain safe but yet offer better specificity, for lack of a better term, with a peptide that you can't get with a small molecule? Whether or not you're modifying a side chain or changing it from a linear peptide to a cyclical peptide, or whatever the targeting may be, and whatever indication you're now. And I'm going outside the bounds of GLP-1. I'm talking about oncology and a lot of other peptides that are looking at other indications. How that morphs, I have no crystal ball with FDA. I can't envision what that's going to look like long term. But to your point, I think you have a valid concern or argument with naltrexone. Where that's going to be 3 years from now, 5 years from now, I wouldn't even want to venture a guess, because if we come back to ChemOutsourcing in 2030, Tim looks like an idiot for offering whatever I would want to say right now. But I will say that the more complex the molecule you have, whether it be a peptide or whatever, you can tend to modify and tweak and change things, biologically speaking, that you can't do with a small molecule, because it's just inherent in the complexity of the molecule itself. So I'll hold my opinion for a while, if I may, but I mean, you have a valid point. It's valid.
Question, like, if you look at the GLP-1s, they're recombinant. Most of the small molecules that are being made are synthetic. That itself is a shift. So, like, you're actually comparing two things. One is recombinant, one is...
Yeah, I mean, you have to deal with a lot of host proteins and other things in purification, and it's muddy. And, okay, yeah, it's... Yeah, it will come out over time. I mean, FDA gets its own guidance through the public domain and reaction on big pharma and lobbyists, and I have no crystal ball for that. I don't know.
Thank you. Rob Geiger, do you, oh, okay, sure. What's your name? Okay, thank you.
What the question that earlier came up and a few gentlemen addressed, I guess, is how to reduce the cost of raw materials, I guess, for CDMOs when preparing the molecules. One thought that I was looking at it for a while is, like, you can make really cheap materials if biologics makes it. I mean, back in the 60s, they tried to make synthetic sugar and synthetic penicillin, and obviously nobody in their right mind would try to do that today. So I'm thinking that with the biological molecules, obviously not synthetic molecules, is it worth looking into that aspect, how to use microbes or different bacteria to make that API rather than raw materials that would have to be sourced from elsewhere in the world?
So maybe I can answer that one. Yeah, I mean, I think that's already being done. So if you look at Novo, when they enter this space, there are two molecules, liraglutide and then semaglutide. They use a semi-synthetic approach. The main backbone is made recombinantly, and then any minor modifications were done synthetically. So there's still a synthetic approach to it. But if you start developing more of these molecules, and you look at the sequence, they're all very similar. The difference is they start using non-conical amino acids, and you can't get microbes to produce the non-conical amino acids. There are new technologies coming out there, but they're not there yet. And so that's the big challenge. So in the case of Lilly, for example, tirzepatide, that has a lot of non-conical amino acids, so they went the synthetic route. So that is sort of like the balance that lasts there. The other approach is looking at amino acid manufacturing itself. Maybe you can use enzymes. So there's a company up in the Bay Area called Airless Bio, for example. This technology comes out of Caltech, and they're looking at doing that and producing these non-conical amino acids in bulk using enzymatic chemistry. However, it's hit or miss, right? The technology, it works for certain building blocks may not work for others. So it's a bit of a challenge, but that is what some of these companies are trying to do.
So there is industry is looking into using enzymatic pathways or other pathways, using something like the
I know.
bacterial microbes to,
It's already being done.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they're further ahead, like Novo uses yeast
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
fermentation. A lot of companies are using E. coli, which is even more efficient.
Yep.
So we're about to enter the end of our conversation here. The last bullet item was small molecule versus large molecule. There's not probably enough time to even cover that. I can tell you that, with the advent of the new molecule that Novo has entered in the race as far as small molecule, oral solids are the hot thing. I heard Steve comment on injectables not being the wave of the future, really. We're going to be looking for small molecules, looking for oral solids. I can't get my wife to even come close to a needle. So it's one of those things where it's going to be a matter of convenience, cost, of course, and oh yeah.
Let's talk about you.
Well, 1 minute left.
Yeah, you got it.
Pictures say 1,000 words, and my drug of choice was tirzepatide. A year ago, I was here, and so that and exercise and making sure you're eating the right things. But yeah, it's amazing. I was able to buy an extension on my life insurance policy, which I couldn't get before all this. So it's made a huge difference. Doctor gets results back on your physical examination, and he sees all these areas that have been improved by these modern-day GLP-1 peptides. It's just absolutely so grateful. So, please. Sure.
Of course, we can see that transformation. What is happening after 7 years or 8 years of launch? Now the molecule is pressing $2 billion, yes, and it may go more than that. So, what has gone wrong in that entire interclinical phase or approval process?
Semaglutide, yeah. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I didn't get the question. You mean about the pharmacovigilance, right? And as I said, 25 years ago, 23 years ago, exenatide was the first GLP-1 approved for type 2 diabetes. I think we have at least 25 years of history with regard to monitoring side effects or any other potential issues. I think these are safe drugs, in my opinion. The only adverse effects that you see are mostly vomiting and diarrhea, constipation in some cases, but that's it. I think, Rob, you can certainly elaborate on that.
Yeah. Semaglutide did not work well for me. Liraglutide did not work well for me. Tirzepatide was, miracle. Just changed my life.
Yeah, but again, I think this takes us still to the small molecules. The difference between peptides and small molecules is that peptides are very specific for their targets and with less side effects than the small molecules, right? You could maybe be worried about the small molecules drugs in the long term, but maybe less about the peptides. Are the small molecules going to compete with the GLP-1s? Potentially, but not the same efficacy. I mean, with peptide, you could design, today we have products that are triple agonists in the pipeline. So the same molecule hits 3 receptors, which is a little bit from the clinical design, a little bit of a challenge, to monitor all of this. Small molecules cannot do that. Small molecule cannot have the same, I would say, an agonist activity on one receptor and antagonist on the other receptor with the same peptide. can't do that with. This is the magic of peptides.
Yes. And just to add to that, many years ago, this is before the wave actually took off, and to the point that you're making, Rob. I asked a friend of mine, a good friend of mine that at that time was working at Lilly. I was like, why are there so many GLP-1 like or metabolic peptides coming to the market? How are you going to sustain all that? Wouldn't the market be saturated? And obviously, it's not been saturated. His answer was simple, and it's actually come out to be true. It doesn't. One drug may work for me, but may not work for you. And I've known people that have been on metformin, insulin, and then gone to Lyra and so forth, and they've just jumped and ended up sticking with one that works for them. So I think there's still a market. I know, Steve, you were saying that the injectable wave is going to come down, but to the point Mimoun made, the small molecules will have toxic effects. We've seen Pfizer drop 2 products. We saw Lilly drop 2 products last week, although their one product is doing really well right now. So I think there's still a space in this area for this. And it just depends on the patient and what works for that patient.
And I don't think injectable, I'm sorry, don't misquote me. I mean, to get drugs developed, and I happened to see the CEO of Pfizer, Borland, speak at a synagogue of all places, but he said AI and what's coming, and he tried to explain how he got his 2-year approval using AI, but in the end of the day, drug development is drug development. Even 505(b)(2), we're talking complex innovation here. So injectables is not going away. Please don't misquote me. I just feel that, obviously efficacy and being able to take, not have a needle would be that's going to change the market like peptides have, I think. So, but it's going to take time, obviously.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.